there came a time when it became clear to me that the kind of scholarship I wanted to do, that was sort of unapologetic, full-throated endorsement of the West. I love the West. I love the cultural products of Athens and Jerusalem. I don't think they're the property of eggheads like me. I think they're the property of everybody. And I think that what they really amount to is food for the soul. And that's what's so starving. And so after grad school, I kind of left the academy, and I instead came to work at Claremont, which is a, highly, I think, intellectually respectable institution, but it's not, it's also critical, like me, of our establishment elites. And Young Heretics, which is my podcast, arose kind of naturally out of all of this, in the sense that people were sort of saying, I was writing, I was doing things out and about, and I was kind of making a career for myself as what you might call a public intellectual, although that always sounds so pompous.
Doesn't it though?
But it's like a super jerk. It is an annoying thing to say that you are.
I'm a public figure.
I'm an influencer. Yeah, that's right. But maybe you've experienced this. It's like when you are a public figure or an influencer or whatever, the first thing that anybody says when they meet you is, you should start a podcast. And because that's like the thing, right? Is everybody has to have a podcast. And my feeling was like, everybody has, like, what do I have to talk about that somebody isn't already talking about? I felt like the space was so full. And so I said, all right, well, if I'm going to start a podcast, I'm going to sort of talk about what I want to talk about. And that's just, I have like 5 listeners. Nobody will listen because it's going to be about Homer and Plato and the Bible and all of the great tradition that has emerged out of that. And I genuinely was just sort of like, well, I'll do this as a side project. It'll be a labor of love. And almost immediately, what I found is this enormous hunger out there just for the good stuff. It's like, it's so weird to me that that's true, except that the more this craziness goes on, the more the kind of BLM stuff snowballs, the more the critical race theory stuff gets out of hand, the more they cancel. I mean, Princeton University, ostensibly one of the best institutions of higher learning in the country, just canceled its requirement that classics students read Greek and Latin. That's what classics is reading Greek and Latin. So they basically, they're eating themselves alive. And so people have nowhere to go for this stuff. And so when somebody like me just grabs a mic and says, I'm going to rant for an hour at you about why you need to read Dante, or I'm going to tell you about why, these classical virtues like, courage and temperance, these things are, not just kind of academic subjects, but essential parts about how to be a human being, how to wake up in the morning, go about do stuff. That's not innovative. I didn't invent that. I just am the only one of the only people out there just giving it to people. And so, it's sad that that's the state we're in, but it also brings me great joy to hear from people about, I'm on my tractor and I'm listening to you talk about Aristotle or whatever. Yeah. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's incredible. And yes, it is true that to look towards the classics and to Lindy things is actually sort of being out there on the fringe right now. Right. And we're seeing a very overt attempt by the Blue Church or Cathedral or whomever you want to call them to extinguish these books once and for all. Get the white men out of our canon, take down the statues, get rid of the language. I mean, I think personally, from reading classics, the limited that I have, I'm trying to keep up. There's a lot, by the way.
There are a lot of books out there.
There's a lot of books out there. And in my experience of trying to uncover this stuff, it's like the answers are in the ancient texts, the answers for today. And so that's probably why they want to get rid of them. And that's why they want to make it so that we don't have any access to it. And what I find about really fascinating about your background and your experience is that you are classically trained in the cathedral, in the Blue Church. It doesn't get any more steeped in all of the establishment than you can get. But you came into it likely with a different perspective. You came into it probably like prophylactically like safe against getting corrupted and wokeified while you're there. Is that right? I'm making a guess here, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
did you go to these institutions knowing where you wanted to end up one day, or was there something about your experience there that made you realize we need to go back and really hammer on this stuff, or how did that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the one of the weird things, you know, in the Iliad, which is one of the first
Do it.
things I covered on the show, it's,
Do
you
it.
know, sort of the origin in a lot of ways of certainly of ancient Greek literature and one of the great foundation stones of Western literature. Um, Greater Ajax, who's like this giant dude. He's, you know, people in that era were already mythically huge, and Ajax is a big one. Um, and he strides, he's so big that he strides from ship to ship, like he walks across the decks of the ship, of these different ships, you know, the giant Greek fleet, and he's striding across them. I kind of think of my education like that, except that the ships were sinking. It was like each thing that I touched on. You know, I left Yale in 2014. In 2015, that video came out, and then and so I always want to be careful to make clear that I had nothing but a great time at these institutes. I mean, and there are still, and there will probably, you know, until there's an actual like great purge, until we're genuinely in hot gulag summer and people are getting carted off to the camps, right? That there's still going to be people doing good work in these institutions because there's funding for it and there's a tradition of it and all this stuff. And so you can pick your way, like I did, through Yale had a great books program, all this stuff. Um, and I do think I was to some extent inoculated against like woke brainwashing because I mean I grew up in a what you might call a mixed household. My dad's a conservative, my mom's a liberal, and so I heard those conversations at the dinner table, and I was aware that neither of those positions, as typically understood in American life, is evil. Right? It's not evil to be a conservative. It's not evil to be a kind of classical liberal, and so I think in that regard, yeah, I went in with a certain degree of defense against it. But you know, when the Princeton thing happened, it suddenly occurred something that should have been obvious to me, but wasn't. Suddenly occurred to me, which was, you know, these organizations were founded, many of them, as seminaries. That is to teach priests how to be priests. I mean, it's one of the origin of the medieval university is clerical training, and the structure of them is that they are funded by the wealthy and powerful in this country. And when this country was founded, the elite class was a kind of Puritan, religious Christian leadership. And now our elite class is converting to this blue church, like you're saying. It's a different religion, and it's a religion of racial guilt and grievance. It's a religion of extreme gender confusion, which boils down ultimately to hatred of the human, to disgust with what it is to be a human being. And those things are articles of faith, just as much as the Trinity is an article of faith, except unlike the Trinity, which is good, the woke creed is evil. And so in some ways, unfortunately, it's kind of natural for these institutions to turn into indoctrination camps for this new creed. It's terribly sad, of course, but we all have to remember, I think, that like Socrates was executed by the state, right? I mean, the Athenians actually sent him to his death for preaching against the gods of the city and for corrupting the youth. And so this is nothing new. We you know, and I guess that I have always had, even as a kid growing up, that tragic sense of life that like the truth has no place to lay its head. And I think for most of all, when these universities started to go insane, that helped me, I think, to understand it, is just that sense that like this is kind of the way of the world in some way.